Huh? Okay, so, in that big old Dead Space video I finally got around to finishing, I made frequent reference to Resident Evil 4, and how could I not? It's one of the best and most important action games of my lifetime, and set the standard for how third-person action games should be framed. The games that built upon it shone the brightest, the games that shied away from its advancements kinda faltered. But what about the games that rely solely on Resident Evil 4 and its nostalgia? Yeah, I kinda dropped a hint at how I felt about The Evil Within right at the end of the Dead Space retrospective. There hasn't been another franchise quite like it, and if you want proof of that, you can see how little The Evil Within learned from Dead Space 2 and how much it shamelessly curbed from Resi 4 to middling response. But truth be told, I hadn't made it very far. My dad keeps picking it up and dropping it, so I eventually decided, well, I guess one of us has to beat this thing. You are Sebastian Castellanos, investigating a mass homicide at the Beacon Mental Hospital, and then, things happen and you travel in a straight line to advance the plot. Okay, that's not really fair. Honestly, the beginning is one of the things I really like about this game. I'm getting really sick of games with intros that last for an hour before you get to the meat of things, so good on Evil Within for giving you your first monster encounter within 5 minutes of starting up the game. However, the relative lack of context hurts the game as it goes on, and this feeling kicks in as soon as the third level. Recognize this? Yeah, perhaps the biggest piece of widespread criticism is that it's clear director Shinji Mikami was either relying on nostalgia or just plain bereft of ideas, because there are quite a number of set pieces and ideas from Resident Evil that are just stolen. This village, the village having a chainsaw boss character, the first enemy feasting next to a decapitated head, the El Gigante twins, and many more moments besides. I do have other observations about this game, obviously, but that's what the majority of my impressions come down to. It's Resident Evil 4, but lesser. But surely there's nothing wrong with trying to improve on a classic. After all, Resident Evil 4 is not a perfect game, and I welcome any attempt to sharpen it. Sadly, no, because even with the amazing ability to move while you shoot, Evil Within is still quite janky. Just something about the way everything moves, and you can never really aim right, and how easily all of your actions can be interrupted. Like, a huge part of the combat against the main enemies of the game is that you can instantly kill them when you set them on fire, usually when you light a match when they've been knocked down. And it's possible to grab 2 or 3 at the same time if you position yourself right. However, you can be knocked out of the animation. If the enemy starts to get up, you can miss the toss. It's hard to tell how many enemies are going to be hit, and it's hard to tell when an enemy is dead at all. So all of these mean it's very easy to waste matches. To say nothing of how ammo for the crossbow is handled, how is anyone expected to check on their ammo in the middle of a fight? Resi 4 is kind of a dated game, and some people can't quite get to grips with the idea of not being able to move and shoot, and having to keep pulling up the inventory. But there's still a flow to it that Evil Within just lacks. In Resi 4 there are plenty of context-sensitive melee attacks to even the odds. Here, don't even bother with melee. The sprint in Resi 4 can always be used, but Evil Within's has a low stamina pool, and if it bottoms out, you're pretty much done. And so on and so forth. My critic powers are failing me, I understand, but take it from me, this game is worse to control than it should be. Sometimes combat can be tense, but often it's just a mess. Design-wise, things aren't much better either. The opening levels lead you to believe it's going to be an open romp about using stealth to save resources, evading traps and drawing your gun only as a last resort. But any attempt by this game to be Splinter Cell falls kind of flat, and those parts don't even come up that often. Remember that sort of vibe I was talking about in my Ultra Despair Girls review? Don't watch that review. This sort of chapter-based, ultimately linear with a few secrets off the beaten path level design, where the challenges are regulated by either limiting the mechanical capabilities of your character or throwing in some sort of gimmick to keep things fresh, got, I don't want to say old, but transparent ages ago. And a lack of context truly does hurt the game as it goes on. Who are these guys? Who is this nurse? What does this machine do? Why do you warp between locations so suddenly? Actually, that last one's easy to puzzle out, but the point is, it's hard to get invested when there's no common ground to stand on, and it starts to feel like the game came before the atmosphere and story. Like, that village is a clear takeoff of Resident Evil 4, and the reason it's so early in the game, I imagine, is some attempt to showcase the game's credentials, but all it does is make me think how much I'd rather be playing Resident Evil 4. All that said, the game eventually finds a pulse of its own of sorts. I dare say the first third of the game is easily the worst, but afterwards Evil Within reveals a few original ideas of its own, and does some kind of decent-ish things with its horror. Sort of. The best bits of horror in the game are the sudden moments of panic, suddenly being chased or locked in a puzzle room that will kill you, and you have to scramble for a solution because, yeah, it's kind of harrowing to just be thrown into a situation like that. When the gore, the sound design, and the up and down pace work together, Evil Within can be kind of nerve-wracking. Chapters 7 and 10 are probably the best because it's just room upon room upon room of various things that can kill you, and it's hard to catch a breather. When a game throws a really strong monster at you and you have to scramble to kill it or run away or, God forbid, distract it, the lethality of the situation is always emphasised, and it turns Evil Within from a goofy shoot 'em up pretending to be Far Cry to a survival horror game, still leaning on the action side of things, but where you have to fight for every single bullet. But even this is kind of thin on the ground because there's a fine line between Evil Within's environment being a source of ever-present danger and there just being the developers saying, look how many saw blades we can put in a room. And they clearly realise this on some level, because once you exit that house of horrors, it becomes the final act of Resident Evil 4 married with Disaster Day of Crisis. Now, this moving architecture in an already ruined city is actually really fucking cool, but it also leads back into the sort of set pieces I said I was sick of seeing. I haven't seen a game get this uncharacteristic throw 30 goons into a room 3 at a time set piece right yet, but Evil Within might have the most bizarre of all. Combine that with goofy water puzzles, a baffling on-rails section where it's not clear when you need to get off the gun, and a general ineptitude at how Evil Within regulates its difficulty, and it's just... eesh. I don't hate this game, but as someone interested in auteurism, I just don't know what I'm meant to get out of the experience as a whole, if not Resident Evil 4 but lesser. Granted, I guess this doesn't apply to the story, which is still marred by all sorts of clunkiness. The game gets started straight away, which again I'm very thankful for in this day and age, but after a while I began to wonder just who I was shooting and why I was in any danger at all. Like, the basic premise is there, digging up enough audio tapes reveals all of the characters are trapped in the villain's mind, basically. But every other element is either not explained or is left so vague that any interpretation is valid. It takes the model viewer after you beat the game for some dots to be connected. I don't know, 7 years on from Inception, holy god, Inception is 7 years old. This sort of is this a dream within a dream, or is this real life narrative takes great care and balance to pull off, to remain interesting and to keep the viewer guessing, and Tango Gameworks just couldn't pull it off. For example, Sebastian's drip-fed story about losing his daughter in a fire at home mirrors that of Ruvik losing his sister in a barn fire, which is a metaphor for the two being... what? What's the connection other than the fire? They're two different characters otherwise, and Ruvik's motivations are so confused. Does he just want revenge? If he's also trapped in his own brain and looking to get out, and he realises he's just a brain in a jar at this point, what's his plan to escape? And if he is just a brain in a jar, how did all these other test subjects land in his nightmare? Christ, this story. The ending is just beyond commentary. I mean, I guess the final battle is kind of climactic, but the game ends with so many questions unanswered that this panaway is, with exception to Deus Ex, more of a fuck you buy the DLC than any game I've ever played. So I did. The Assignment sees you taking control of Kidman, who betrayed Sebastian right at the end, tried to kill the ultimate conduit of Leslie, and oversaw him in a STEM unit, I think. Look, this story is hard to follow. The sudden revelation of there being a secretive third party kind of takes the wind out of the sails, honestly, but it does make things click more as Kidman has to meet up with... wait a minute. Sudden cover system, a mechanic to focus the flashlight, revamped health system... kill me. Yeah, this forced stealth campaign DLC has worked a grand total of 0 times before, but no, I'm sure we'll get it right this time. No, I'm sorry, I cannot stand this sort of gameplay. Tonally correct or not, stealth gameplay is hard to nail from the ground up, let alone when you're tacking it onto a pre-existing framework. Evil Within has stealth elements, but it is not built for in-depth stealth gameplay, and again, this is just a trend I'm tired of seeing. This segmented us, you can tell we're working by the skin of our teeth by how stop-start each stealth room is and how barely functioning our mechanics are style. Good grief. That said, it's a step up in terms of presentation. With the extra clarifications from going through the game through the eyes of a side character, several events are posted with more clarity, and the extra dimension actually full on explains elements of the story and of the setting. That village makes sense now, and hits hard. Ruvik's plan? Explained. He wants to use Leslie's body in the real world to essentially come back from the dead. Why was this so hard to explain in the main game? I mean, that's the thing, it's not bereft of inspired moments where the heavy mystery works, but so much of it is so waffly that the artistry can only really come out when it's laid bare, when you can see the roots of inspiration. There is something to the setting of a collective unconscious, it's just that for the most part it seems like an excuse for things to just get weird. Which would honestly go down better if the gameplay were, but it's not. It's really not. The story of The Assignment continues in The Consequence, which actually elevates the whole package a lot. Except for the gameplay, that's still slapdash. But the story is given the clarity it needs to function as a narrative here, while keeping the mystery intact and making several thematic ties that were desperately needed to give the main campaign a sense of weight. For example, providing a really good reason to make Ruvik's and Sebastian's backstories the same, and making XCOM here really threatening. As I mentioned, powerful clandestine organisations can help the underlying scare factors of these things a lot. Something really interesting it does is the way it handles protagonist perspective. Kidman is actually the main star of the show, and playing through this highlights how Sebastian and Joseph are just stowaways. You really get a sense for how much more clear proceedings are from her perspective, and it doesn't just make her someone who betrays you at the end anymore. They also finally managed to make it ambiguous as to who the real villain is. Ruvik is of course a sociopath bent on reuniting with his sister at all costs, but it turns out to be the Doctor that drags everyone into this hell world to begin with. And of course there's the shadowy Mobius group, and who knows what the fuck they're doing. Honestly, it started reminding me of Condemned at points, but you see how this improves things, right? We have more context now, enough to understand the basics of what to fight for, but enough of it is kept hidden to lead to alternative interpretations. It's that balance I was talking about, it's struck much better here. The thing is, even though I appreciate the story more in hindsight, knowing what I know now, I'm not sure they couldn't have just found a way to write the main story better. Keeping things from Sebastian? Sure. Keeping things from us? Less good. And even besides all the advancements in making the story worthwhile, the gameplay is ho-hum in The Consequence, including a few painful sections where you have to burn some paintings controlling Leslie, all the while he's moaning in pain the entire time you have to play Ring Around Rosie with these fuckheads. It's certainly the least impressive chapter environment-wise. Here's hoping that the final piece of DLC, The Executioner, is better. When I saw the Steam trailer, I honestly didn't think that was what was going to be happening. But yep, this is what the Executioner looks like. Wow, it really does remind me of Condemned now. The plot, as it were, is that the DLC takes place well after the game, with Mobius running its own tests on STEM for God knows what reason. One of the workers' daughters is trapped in a machine and you have to go in as the safe monster to get her out. Never mind, the monster is meant to be a metaphor for Ruvik's insecurity regarding secrets, so this monster shouldn't exist because he's quote-unquote dead by this point. Just in case you thought Resident Evil was the only survival horror franchise being imitated. The DLC lasts an hour and seems to be their attempt at Mercenaries, what with its currency system rewarding repeat fights and grading performance. But, like, yeah, Evil Within is not a mechanically sound game to begin with. You've got a first-person melee system in there, and I don't know what you're hoping to achieve. Safe to say you can totally skip this. It's just such an unambitious piece of content. Honestly, I would call the game's biggest flaws a result of the lack of ambition, or at least of perspective in what ambition they did have. Compare Evil Within to the big horror game of 2014, Alien Isolation, whose setup isn't any more complicated than, boo, Alien, but there's a lot more nuance and grace elements to its execution that elevates it. Or even compare it to the actual big horror game of 2014, Five Nights at Freddy's. Also a very simple premise pulled off with underlying flair. Five Nights took off in a way no one expected, but Evil Within floundered just as everyone predicted once they started playing, because once you get past all the mind-bending is this a dream fluff, you're left with a game that either throws as much blood at you as it can in the hopes that it sticks, or is, all together now, Resident Evil 4 but lesser. And the problem is that Resi 4 is dirt cheap nowadays. It even came bundled with Resi 7 for some reason. Now, I played through 7 at my mum's house, which is why you won't see a review on it here for some time, if at all. I simply couldn't grab the footage. But even though I'm probably one of the game's bigger critics, even the bigwigs at Capcom realise what works about the past, but also what needs revamping or recontextualising. Meanwhile, Mikami is either resting on his laurels or is simply not a man with a lot of ideas. And given the fact that this game actually got a sequel, I'm inclined to believe the latter.